Some folks will tell you that rain is just weather, nothing more than water falling from a tired sky. But I've lived long enough to know that rain has a way of showing you exactly where you stand in this world. Whether you've got a roof waiting for you or nothing but open ground and the sound of your own breathing. And on that particular evening somewhere outside a small Texas way station, the kind of place most folks pass through without remembering, the rain came down steady and cold, turning the dust to mud and the road into something a body had to fight just to cross. And in the middle of it stood a young woman who had nowhere left to go, her dress soaked through, clinging to her arms and legs, her dark hair pinned back, but already coming loose in strands that stuck to her face, her hands wrapped tight around a folded letter that had long since bled its ink into nothing but gray shadows, as if even the words meant for her had decided to leave her behind. And she didn't cry, not then, not when the last wagon had rolled away hours ago, not when the station door shut with a final kind of quiet that said nobody was coming. Because some people learn early that tears don't change a thing, they just make the waiting colder. And so she stood there for a long while, maybe 10 minutes or maybe an hour. Time moves different when you've got nothing holding it in place, until at last she looked down at that ruined paper in her hands, pressed it flat once against her palm like she could smooth the truth back into it, and then she folded it careful, like it still mattered, and tucked it into the small satchel at her side, the only thing she carried in this world that hadn't already slipped away. And without another glance toward the empty road behind her, she stepped off the wooden platform and into the rain, her boots sinking half an inch into the soft earth with each step, the cold working its way up through the soles and into her bones. But she kept walking just the same, steady and quiet, the way a person does when turning back isn't an option anymore, when the only thing left is forward, even if forward doesn't promise much of anything, and the land stretched out ahead of her wide and open, broken only by scrub brush and the faint outline of distant hills, the kind of country that didn't care who you were or what you'd lost, the kind that would test you without asking permission. And somewhere along that road, maybe a mile out or maybe less, the sound came first, soft at the edge of the rain, the uneven shift of hooves against wet ground, and she slowed just enough to listen, her breath catching for a second before settling again, because out here, anything out of place could mean trouble or it could mean something else entirely. And when the shape finally came into view through the gray curtain of falling water, it was a horse, tall and broad-shouldered, standing still in the middle of the path with its reins dragging loose, its sides dark with rain, and something else she couldn't yet make out. And it watched her as she approached, ears forward, not spooked, not running, just waiting like it had been waiting for a while. And she didn't rush, didn't reach for it right away, just stepped closer one careful pace at a time until she could see the saddle, the worn leather, the marks of use, the life tied to it. And then beyond it, just off the road where the ground dipped slightly, there was a figure lying still against the earth, half shadowed by the low brush and the falling rain, and she stopped there for a moment, her eyes moving from the horse to the man and back. Again, the road stretching on behind her, open and empty, and the cold settling deeper into her bones. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, she understood something plain and simple, that she could keep walking and no one would ever know she'd passed this place. Or she could step off that road and change the course of more than just her own night. And for a long second she didn't move at all, just stood there with the rain running down her face and her hands hanging empty at her sides, as if the world itself had paused to see what kind of choice she would make. The wind picked up, howling through the trees as Eliza crouched down beside the man, her fingers trembling but steady as she reached for the reins of the horse. She'd never been good at this, never been good at helping, at offering anything without expecting the same in return, but something about the stillness of the moment felt like it was asking for more. The horse stood quiet, as if waiting for her to make a move, and with one slow breath, she untied the reins from where they had been left hanging loose, the leather slick from the rain but firm under her fingers. She had never been this close to a horse before, never had a reason to be, but the animal didn't flinch. It only stared at her with calm, dark eyes, almost as if it understood the weight of the choice she was making. Eliza looked back down at the man. His face was pale, lips cracked from the cold and dehydration, but his eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven, as though he was fighting to stay awake. She'd seen men like this before. Tough, silent, used to the land and its harshness. But never with this kind of vulnerability, never with this kind of trust written across his features. Without thinking, she reached out, fingers brushing the side of his neck, testing for warmth, and to her surprise, she found it. He was still alive. Barely. And something inside her, something she didn't quite understand yet, pushed her to do more. She stood up, taking a step back as she looked around the desolate stretch of land. There was no sign of any other travelers, no help coming from anywhere she could see. No one would be passing by anytime soon. She would have to make a decision. She could leave him here, let him fight for survival on his own, or she could do what she never thought she would, help. She took a deep breath, then bent down, her hands slipping under his arms, pulling him up gently but firmly, careful not to jostle him too much. His body was heavy against hers, but somehow, she managed to lift him just enough to guide him toward the horse. The animal didn't resist, following her lead as she steadied the man in her arms, one leg over the saddle, then the other, until she had him sitting upright, though barely. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady rhythm that beat against the earth, washing away everything it touched. Eliza glanced up at the sky, seeing nothing but endless gray. She wasn't sure where she was going, or if she was even capable of getting them there, but the one thing she knew was that she couldn't leave him. Not like this. Not when she had the chance to help. Her hands were trembling as she mounted the horse herself, pulling the reins in one hand and using the other to steady the man against her. With a soft click of her tongue, she urged the horse forward, moving slowly at first, but the animal seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, trotting along with a steady pace, its hooves splashing through the mud. Eliza kept her eyes focused on the path ahead, her heart racing with every step they took. She didn't know where they were headed, but she had to keep moving. She had no other choice. And in that moment, as the rain continued to fall and the world around them seemed to blur into nothing but water and mist, Eliza knew one thing for sure. She would never be the same. Not after tonight. The rain kept coming, pouring down like the sky had opened up and decided to wash the world clean, but Eliza didn't notice the cold anymore. She could feel the warmth of the man pressed against her, his body slowly growing heavier with every step the horse took. His breath was still shallow, and she had to keep adjusting him in the saddle to make sure he didn't slide off. The wind was picking up, howling through the empty land like it was trying to chase them away, but Eliza held on tight. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew they couldn't stop. The horse's hooves splashed through the mud, and the further they traveled, the more the land seemed to stretch out, barren and endless. She thought about how she had walked this path earlier, alone, with nothing but the sound of the rain and her own thoughts for company. But now, she wasn't alone. Now, there was a man with her, a stranger who might have been dead by morning if she hadn't stopped. The road was quieter now, the world outside their little bubble of movement swallowed up by the constant drum of rain and wind, but there was a strange comfort in that. No distractions, no one watching them. Just the sound of the horse and the rain and her own heartbeat, steady and slow. She had no idea how long they had been traveling. Time didn't make much sense in a storm. Every minute felt like an hour, and yet, it all blurred together into one endless stretch of rain and mud and cold. But Eliza didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not when she had someone relying on her. The man stirred once, his hand twitching at his side, and Eliza's heart skipped. She hadn't realized how much she was holding her breath until that moment, and she exhaled slowly, willing him to wake up, to say something, to make sure he was still alive. But the only sound that came from him was a low moan, his head lolling against her shoulder. She bit her lip, eyes scanning the horizon ahead. There was a light, a faint glow, far off in the distance. Her heart lifted, just for a second, as she pushed the horse forward, urging it into a faster pace. The glow didn't get any closer at first, but she didn't give up. She had to get to it. They had to get there. With the rain falling harder, she could barely see where the road was leading, but the light was still there, flickering, like a promise she didn't quite believe in yet. She held on, tighter now, feeling the man's breath against her neck, his body shifting slightly with the movement of the horse. She didn't care how far it was. She didn't care what came next. All that mattered was getting to that light. They would make it. She had to believe that. She wouldn't let herself think anything else. Another hour passed. Or maybe it was more. She couldn't tell. But the light had gotten closer, and with it came the unmistakable outline of a house, barely visible through the downpour. But it was there. A house. Someone who might help. She pushed the horse even harder, her hand gripping the reins, urging the animal on. The warmth of the house, of the light, was almost within reach, and for the first time since she had stepped off that platform, since the rain had started, Eliza allowed herself to hope. They would be all right. She just had to keep going. And that house, that light, would be their salvation. The house finally came into full view, standing like a lone sentinel against the storm. Eliza didn't wait for the horse to slow, urging it forward as the rain poured in torrents around them, soaking her through to the bone. The light from the windows flickered like a distant star, welcoming but uncertain. She pushed the reins with a firm hand, guiding the horse toward the wooden porch, her heart pounding with both exhaustion and a fragile hope. The horse's hooves clattered against the porch as she gently dismounted, careful not to disturb the man still slumped in front of her. Her legs wobbled as she landed, the cold setting deep into her skin, but she didn't let herself falter. She had come this far, and nothing would stop her now. Her hands, shaking with both cold and worry, reached up to knock on the door, the sound sharp against the storm. She stood back, breathless, watching the door with a mixture of anticipation and fear. The seconds felt like minutes, each one heavier than the last. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, and an older man stood there, his features soft with age but alert with concern. He didn't speak right away, just eyed her and the man on the horse. Eliza swallowed, her throat dry from the long ride and the endless rain. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "he needs help. He's hurt." The man's eyes flickered to the figure slumped on the horse, then back to her, his gaze softening. Without a word, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. Eliza didn't need another invitation. She moved quickly, her body screaming in protest with every step, but she forced herself forward, leading the horse into the warmth of the house. Inside, the scent of burning wood and the faint smell of fresh bread greeted her, a sharp contrast to the wet and cold of the world outside. The man helped her guide the injured man into a chair by the hearth, his hands surprisingly steady for someone so old. Eliza stood there for a moment, her eyes fixed on the man's face, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the room, and she realized, for the first time in hours, that she was no longer alone. The old man busied himself with setting out supplies, his movements methodical and efficient. "You did well," he said after a long silence, his voice low but kind. Not everyone would have stopped for a stranger. Eliza didn't know what to say. She couldn't explain why she had done it, why she had refused to leave him there, alone in the storm. She didn't have a reason. Maybe there wasn't one. As the man worked, Eliza moved to the window, gazing out into the rain. Her thoughts swirled, a confusing mix of fear, relief, and the remnants of a dream she didn't know how to make sense of. The world outside was still, quiet now, as though waiting with her. The man, still unconscious, shifted slightly in the chair, and she turned her attention back to him. She hadn't expected to find anything but the harshness of the land, but somehow, in the midst of the storm, she had found something more, something worth fighting for. The old man moved around the room with a quiet kind of purpose, his hands steady as he set out the bandages and the small glass bottles of ointment. Eliza couldn't tear her eyes away from the injured man sitting by the fire. His breathing had steadied, and his skin no longer felt as cold as it had earlier, but there was something about the way his eyes flickered behind closed lids that kept her on edge. She stood there for a moment, watching the firelight dance on his features, the shadows moving across his face. He didn't look like much now, but Eliza had seen the way people like him survived, silent, strong, but scarred in ways that weren't always visible. The old man worked with a practiced hand, cleaning the wound on the stranger's side with care, his eyes focused as if he had done this countless times before. Eliza's own hands still shook from the ride, from the cold and the fear that had been building up ever since she had seen him lying in the dirt. She wasn't sure what to do with herself. She wanted to ask him why he was out there in the storm, why he had been left alone, but she didn't know if he would answer. And maybe, part of her didn't want to know. The old man noticed her hesitation and spoke, his voice calm and patient, as though he knew exactly what she needed. "You did good, girl. There ain't too many who would have stopped for a stranger." Eliza didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure if it was because she had seen too much in her life, or because, in that moment, there was a kind of quiet between them that said everything without needing words. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes still locked on the man, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The old man glanced over at her, noticing the concern in her eyes. "He'll be all right," he said, his tone soothing. "Might take a few days, but he'll pull through. The storm's fierce, but we've got time. You've done all you can for now." Eliza didn't reply. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of the man's words in her chest, a small flicker of relief settling in. As the fire crackled in the hearth, the old man moved to a corner, gathering some blankets and placing them gently over the injured man. Eliza took a deep breath, her body still tight with the tension that hadn't let go since the moment she had found him. As she watched the flames dance, she realized something. She didn't know where this journey was taking her, didn't know if she was doing the right thing by staying, by helping him. But somehow, in the quiet of the room, with the storm still raging outside, she felt a pull, a connection to this place, to this man, that she couldn't explain. The world beyond the door was still cold and unforgiving, but inside, the warmth from the fire, from the silence, from the shared moments between two strangers, those things kept her anchored, even if just for a little while. She sat back into a chair near the hearth, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the table as her mind wandered. She had no answers, only a growing understanding that sometimes it wasn't about finding the right path, but about walking it, even when the way seemed uncertain. She looked over at the old man, who had returned to his seat by the window, his eyes closing as he leaned back in his chair. The night was quiet now, save for the sound of the rain. Outside, the world felt far away, but here, in this small house, in the warmth of the fire, it felt like there might be a way forward, even if neither of them knew what that path would look like. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time the old man set the last of the firewood on the hearth, the room growing warmer with each passing minute. Eliza had stayed close, her body slowly relaxing as the heat seeped into her chilled bones. The stranger, still unconscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, was now wrapped in the blanket, his wounds treated as best as the old man could manage with the supplies on hand. Eliza didn't know how long it would take for him to wake up, but part of her didn't mind the silence. It gave her time to think, to process what had happened, and to wonder where her path would lead now. She glanced out the window at the clearing skies, the moon faint behind a veil of clouds, and realized that everything had changed in a matter of hours. She wasn't the same person who had arrived at the station, unsure of what the world held for her. No, now there was a strange sense of purpose pulling her forward, as if she had been brought here for a reason, as if she had been meant to find this house, this man. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it in the way her heart had steadied, in the way she wasn't as afraid anymore. The old man sat across from her, his face weathered and wise. "You're a long way from where you started," he said, his voice low and gravelly but gentle. Eliza looked up at him, unsure how to respond, but he didn't seem to expect an answer. He just gave her a small nod and settled back into his chair, the firelight flickering across his tired features. "We all end up somewhere, girl. Don't matter how far you walk, or how heavy the rain falls. What matters is what you do with it once you're here." Eliza felt his words sink deep into her, more than she was willing to admit. She didn't know what she would do with all of this, with the man who lay unconscious by the fire, with the storm that had passed and left her here, but she knew one thing. She wasn't ready to leave yet. Not tonight. She wasn't ready to walk away from this moment, from the quiet understanding that had settled between them, like a thread weaving through the storm, keeping them anchored in place. She looked back at the stranger, his face softened in sleep, his features less harsh now that the tension had left him. He didn't look like a man who needed saving, but there was something about him, something broken, that spoke to her in ways she couldn't quite explain. He had been left behind, just like her, and now here they were, two strangers brought together by fate, by the rain. She couldn't leave him. Not yet. She moved toward the hearth, kneeling beside the fire to add a few more logs, her hands steady as she worked. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room, and for a moment, Eliza let herself close her eyes, just listening to the rhythm of it. The world outside might still be cold and unforgiving, but in here, in the warmth of the fire and the quiet company of the old man and the stranger, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, or if the man would even remember her when he woke. But for the first time in a long while, Eliza felt like she had a place here, even if it was just for the night. And that was enough for now. The morning light crept through the cracks in the wooden shutters, casting thin beams of pale light onto the floor. Eliza stirred in her seat, the warmth of the fire from the night before still lingering in the room. The stranger had not stirred, still unconscious, his breathing steady but shallow. The old man had kept watch over him throughout the night, checking on him every so often, but now it was Eliza's turn. She stood up slowly, stretching her stiff muscles, and walked over to the fire, adding a few more logs to the embers, watching them catch and crackle. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and the steady ticking of a clock on the wall filled the empty space. She glanced at the stranger again, her heart tightening in her chest. He was still out, but there was something about him now that seemed less desperate, less broken. It was as if the warmth of the house, the simple act of being cared for, had begun to restore him, piece by piece. Eliza didn't know why she cared so much. She didn't know why she had stayed, or why she couldn't leave. But something about him, about the way he had looked when she found him, had made her stay, had made her want to help. Maybe it was because she saw a little of herself in him, a little of the loneliness, the weight of being left behind. Maybe she saw a chance to fix something that had been broken for too long. She turned her back to the fire, glancing toward the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with clouds, as though the world was waiting for something. She could feel the weight of it, the stillness of the air, and she knew that she couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, she would have to move on. But for now, she was here, and she had to make the most of it. She walked back to the stranger's side, kneeling beside him, her fingers brushing the damp hair from his forehead. He shifted slightly, a faint groan escaping his lips, and for the first time, Eliza felt a flicker of hope. He was waking. His eyes fluttered open, a dull blue light shining through the haze of exhaustion and pain. At first, he looked confused, his gaze darting around the room as if he didn't recognize where he was. But then his eyes found hers, and there was a moment of clarity, as though the fog had lifted just enough for him to understand that he wasn't alone anymore. "You're safe," Eliza said softly, her voice gentle. "You're at a house. You're okay now." The man blinked a few times, his lips parting as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he reached up, his hand shaking slightly as he touched his side, where the wound had been treated. His expression shifted, a mix of confusion and gratitude crossing his features. Eliza watched him carefully, her own heart beating faster now that he was awake, now that she could finally see his eyes, see the man behind the silence. "You're going to be all right," she reassured him, her voice steady. "You just need to rest." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. He didn't need to say anything. She could see it in his eyes, the same quiet gratitude she felt, the same sense of relief that they had both made it through the night, through the storm, and into something like safety. As the morning light grew stronger, Eliza stood and moved to the table, gathering a few of the old man's supplies. She set about preparing something simple, a meal to help the stranger regain his strength. As she worked, she glanced back at him, still sitting by the fire, his eyes now closed, his breathing slower, more relaxed. She didn't know where this journey would take her, or what would come of the bond they had shared, but for the first time in a long while, Eliza allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. Something beyond survival. Something beyond the storm. The days passed slowly, and with each one, the stranger's condition improved. Eliza stayed close, tending to him, offering quiet company as the old man made his rounds, checking on the weather and the horses, making sure the firewood was stocked. The rain had stopped, but the land was still soft and heavy with the moisture, the earth dark and rich beneath the clouds that lingered above. Every so often, Eliza would look out the window, wondering if she should leave, wondering if the storm was her only reason for staying. But every time she thought of walking away, she found herself turning back, her feet carrying her back into the warmth of the house. There was something about the stillness of the place, something about the quiet that settled into her bones, that made her reluctant to leave. The stranger, whose name, she had learned, was Isaac, hadn't said much in the days since he had woken up, but his eyes followed her, and sometimes she could see a flicker of recognition in them. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her heart steady, enough to remind her that they had shared something, a moment of survival, and now they were here together, in this strange, unexpected place. One morning, after a few days of tending to him, Isaac sat up on his own, his back pressed against the wall near the fire. Eliza watched him from across the room, her heart skipping a beat as she noticed the way his shoulders no longer slumped, the way his gaze seemed more focused, more present. He looked stronger, not just in body but in spirit. She stepped toward him, careful not to startle him, her voice soft as she spoke. "How are you feeling?" Isaac's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was something in them, something like understanding, something that made Eliza's pulse quicken. "Better," he said, his voice rough but steady. He paused, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Thank you. For everything." Eliza nodded, her throat tight as she tried to find the right words. She wasn't sure why his gratitude hit her so hard, but it did. She had expected to help him, but hearing him say it so simply, so sincerely, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "You're alive. That's all that matters." Isaac studied her for a long moment, his eyes not leaving hers. "I didn't think I'd make it through the night," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "I thought I was done for." Eliza felt a pang in her chest at his words, remembering the way he had looked when she first found him, alone and broken in the rain. "I'm glad you didn't give up," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Isaac gave a small, wry smile, the first real expression she had seen from him. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" he said, his voice softer now. Eliza smiled, her heart lifting at the shift in his demeanor. They were both still here, still breathing, still trying to make sense of the world around them. For the first time in days, Eliza felt a sense of peace settle over her. The uncertainty that had been gnawing at her, the unease she had carried with her for so long, seemed to fade, just a little. Maybe they weren't meant to understand everything just yet. Maybe all they needed to do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. "We're both still here," she said, more to herself than to Isaac, but he heard her, his gaze softening as he nodded in agreement. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. They understood each other in a way that words couldn't express. The world outside was still a mystery, still full of uncertainty, but in that moment, in that room, there was something clear. They were here together, and that was enough for now. The days began to blur together, each one passing with quiet rhythm as Isaac grew stronger under Eliza's care. He spent most of his time by the fire, leaning against the wall, occasionally talking with the old man, but mostly just resting. Eliza had taken to helping with small chores around the house, setting things in order and making sure there was food for both of them. It wasn't much, but the routine gave her a sense of purpose, a steady ground she could walk on. She noticed the change in Isaac's demeanor each day, how he seemed to wake up more, little by little, like a man reawakening from a long sleep. His eyes had become more focused, less clouded with pain or exhaustion, and there were moments when his gaze lingered on her, as if he was trying to say something, but words failed him. And though Eliza didn't expect him to thank her, it was those moments of silent acknowledgement, those flickers of understanding, that made her feel like she had done something right. It was late one afternoon when Isaac finally stood on his own, his legs still shaky, but firm enough to support him. He walked slowly to the window, looking out at the land beyond. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and the land seemed to stretch on forever. The old man had gone to check the horses, leaving Eliza alone in the house with Isaac. She was hesitant to speak at first, but the silence between them had become too heavy, too thick to ignore. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Isaac didn't turn to look at her right away. He stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Better," he said, his voice still rough but stronger than it had been. "I've been worse." Eliza felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips, but she didn't let it show fully. "I'm glad to hear that," she replied, stepping closer. Isaac finally turned to look at her, his gaze lingering for a moment, and for the first time, Eliza saw something there. A quiet understanding, a kind of recognition that made her heart skip. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice quieter now. "You've done more than anyone should." Eliza shrugged, her hands nervously folding and unfolding in front of her. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said softly. I couldn't leave you." Isaac's brow furrowed slightly, and he seemed to think on her words for a moment. Then, without a word, he walked over to her, his steps slow but purposeful. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his body. "You didn't leave me," he said, his voice low. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed." Eliza's breath caught in her throat at his words, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't tell if he meant it in the way she hoped, or if he was just grateful for the help, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The connection between them, quiet and simple, felt like something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. She didn't know what it meant, what it could become, but in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, she understood that she wasn't as alone as she had been before. The world outside still felt vast and uncertain, but in here, in this small house with the fire crackling in the hearth, she felt something that had been missing for a long time. She felt seen. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, until the sound of the old man returning broke the silence. Isaac stepped back, his eyes briefly meeting hers again before he turned toward the door. Eliza exhaled slowly, her heart still beating fast, as if it had been holding its breath since the storm. She didn't know where their paths would lead, but for the first time since she had stepped off that platform, she felt like she was no longer walking alone. The days grew longer, and the quiet routine of life in the house settled into something familiar. Eliza had learned to move through the motions, her mornings spent by the fire, her afternoons tending to the small chores that kept the house in order. Isaac, now recovered enough to be more mobile, would sometimes help with tasks around the yard or sit by the window, his eyes searching the horizon as though waiting for something to appear. The old man, too, had his own rhythm, his steps steady and sure, but there was a weight in the air, a kind of tension that neither of them spoke about, but both felt. Eliza couldn't explain it, but something had shifted between her and Isaac. The unspoken connection that had been there from the moment she had found him seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, like the quiet warmth of the fire that never quite left the room. It wasn't that they talked more, or that anything had changed drastically. It was simply in the way they shared space, the way their silence was comfortable, not awkward. She knew that he understood her in ways that no one else did. He didn't ask questions about her past, and she didn't press him about his. But the bond between them had grown, like roots slowly sinking deep into the earth, unspoken but undeniable. One evening, after dinner, Eliza found herself sitting by the fire again, a quiet restfulness hanging in the air. The old man had gone to bed early, his body tired from the day's work, and Isaac sat across from her, his eyes not on her, but on the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. She wasn't sure what prompted her to speak, but the silence had stretched long enough that the words seemed to fall from her lips without thought. "Why did you come out here?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Isaac didn't immediately answer. He simply sat there, his fingers drumming lightly against the arm of his chair, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I don't know," he said after a moment, his voice rough but sincere. "I thought I was looking for something, but I don't think I found it. Not in the way I expected, anyway." Eliza watched him carefully, sensing that there was more to his answer than he was letting on, but she didn't push. She let him speak in his own time, the quiet of the room allowing him to gather his thoughts. "I left because I thought I needed to," he continued, his voice distant now, "but I wasn't running from something. I was running toward something. Or at least, that's what I told myself." He paused, his eyes flicking toward her for the first time, as if seeking some kind of understanding. "I thought I was looking for a life that made sense. A place where I could just be. But out here, with the land, with the rain and the quiet, it's not what I thought it would be. It's more. But it's also less." Eliza didn't know how to respond. His words hung in the air, a mystery that she didn't have the answers to, but somehow they made sense. She had left, too. Left behind a life that didn't fit, a life that had worn her down until there was nothing left but a quiet hope that something better might be waiting. "I think I understand," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaac didn't say anything in response, but his gaze softened, and for a long moment, they just sat there, the fire crackling between them, the world outside the window silent and still. Eliza didn't know what Isaac had been running from or what he had been searching for. She didn't know if she would ever know. But in that moment, sitting in the warmth of the firelight with the rain falling softly outside, she felt something shift again. The storm had passed. The world outside had quieted, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. It was the kind of peace that came not from having all the answers, but from simply being. Simply existing in the space between two people who, for whatever reason, had been brought together in this quiet house on the edge of the world. The days began to feel longer, and yet they were still full of quiet, of calm that settled over the house like a blanket. Isaac, now fully recovered, had found a rhythm of his own. He worked with the old man, helping with the chores that needed tending to, feeding the horses, mending the fences, chopping wood. Eliza found herself moving alongside them, her days blending into one another with a steady, peaceful flow. The quiet moments stretched on, but there were times, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange, that Eliza couldn't help but look out at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond the hills and the endless expanse of land. The fire crackled every evening, the warmth filling the house, and sometimes Isaac would sit beside it, his gaze distant, lost in thought. And Eliza, she would watch him, a quiet curiosity settling in her chest, wondering if he felt the same kind of pull she did. The pull to leave, to move on, to find something new. But neither of them spoke of it, the silence between them comfortable, as though they both knew that when the time was right, they would leave. The world outside the door still felt wild and uncertain, but in this house, in this small piece of the world, they had found something that felt like home, even if it was only temporary. One evening, after a long day of work, Isaac surprised Eliza by offering to help her with dinner. She was used to doing it on her own, the old man too tired to help and Isaac usually lost in his own thoughts. But tonight, he moved around the kitchen, his movements gentle and purposeful. "I thought I could make something special tonight," he said, his voice low but warm. Eliza looked at him, a little taken aback by the offer. She hadn't expected him to want to help, but as she watched him chop vegetables with ease, she realized that she was grateful. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their actions matching each other in an easy, unspoken harmony. Isaac's presence had become a comfort, a steady force that made the house feel less empty. As the meal simmered on the stove, Eliza felt something shift, a quiet connection that seemed to grow with each passing day. It wasn't something she could explain, but it was there, in the way they shared space, in the small, meaningful moments. When dinner was ready, they sat together at the table, the old man joining them after a long day of work. They ate in a comfortable silence, the sound of their forks scraping against plates the only noise. It was a simple meal, nothing fancy, but it felt like a moment of peace in the midst of everything. Afterward, they sat by the fire, the warmth from the flames chasing away the chill of the evening air. Eliza noticed that Isaac had stopped looking out the window, his gaze no longer distant but focused on the flames, his expression unreadable. She wondered what he was thinking, but she didn't ask. There was something about the stillness of the moment, the way it held them both, that made her realize they didn't need to say anything. The silence was enough. The fire crackled softly, casting a golden glow across the room, and for a moment, Eliza let herself believe that this could be enough, that they could stay here, together, and be content. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, the present was enough. The storm had passed, the rain had stopped, and in this small house on the edge of the world, they had found something that resembled peace. Maybe, just maybe, it was enough to last for a while longer. The days grew warmer, and the change in the air seemed to settle into the house as much as it did the land around them. Isaac, now fully recovered, moved with more confidence, his muscles no longer stiff from the cold, but loose and strong again. He still worked with the old man, the two of them out in the yard tending to the animals and mending what needed mending, but there was a new ease between them. Eliza watched him from the window sometimes, seeing the way he moved, The way he smiled more often now, though it was subtle. There was a stillness to their life here, something that felt simple and unassuming, but it was enough. One evening, after a long day of work, Isaac came inside to find Eliza by the fire, her back to the flames as she stirred a pot of soup. The scent of herbs and vegetables filled the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, just content in the quiet company. It was Isaac who broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking," he said, standing just outside the circle of firelight, his shadow stretching long on the floor. Eliza didn't turn, but she could feel his gaze on her, a quiet weight that pulled her attention. "About what?" she asked, her voice light, but the question held a hint of curiosity. Isaac shifted, his hand running through his hair as he looked out the window. "About what comes next. What we're meant to do." Eliza paused, her spoon still in the pot as she processed his words. She had often wondered the same thing, though she had never said it aloud. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both understood something that the world outside hadn't revealed yet. "I think about that too," Eliza said softly, her eyes still on the fire. "I think about leaving sometimes." But her words trailed off, and she let the quiet fill the space, not needing to explain. Isaac nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think I'm ready to leave yet. Not until I understand what I'm supposed to find here." Eliza finally turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. There was something in his gaze that made her heart tighten, a flicker of understanding that went deeper than words. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Isaac gave her a small smile, the kind that seemed to reach his eyes and warm the room in a way the fire could not. He stepped closer, closer than he had before, and for a brief moment, they just stood there, side by side, watching the flames. There was a quiet peace in the room now, a calm that neither of them had expected, but both had found. Neither spoke of what came next, of the future, or what lay beyond the walls of the house. Instead, they allowed the silence to speak for them. In that quiet space, Eliza knew that she didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know where their paths would take them. All she knew was that, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was home, in a way she hadn't felt in years, and that was enough for now. The air had changed again, the warmth of the day giving way to the crispness of evening as the sun sank low behind the hills. It had been weeks since Eliza had first arrived at the house, and while she had stopped counting the days, she had started to notice the way everything seemed to settle into place. Isaac had found a new rhythm in his life, one that didn't feel as driven by survival or escape. The small, quiet moments they shared seemed to fill the space between them with an understanding that had never been spoken aloud. Each day, the house felt more like home, not because of the walls or the roof, but because of the people who shared it. It was a feeling Eliza hadn't realized she had been longing for, not until it was right there in front of her, quiet and steady. One evening, after a long day working alongside Isaac, Eliza sat on the porch steps, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of the wood as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Isaac came out a few minutes later, his movements easy, his hands still covered in the remnants of work. He stopped beside her, glancing down at her hands before looking out at the horizon. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The sound of the evening breeze, rustling the leaves in the trees, filled the quiet. "You've been quiet lately," Isaac said finally, his voice gentle but curious. Eliza didn't look up at him immediately, taking a moment to let his words sink in. It wasn't that she had been avoiding him or anything. It was just that there was something about this place, about the stillness of it all, that made her reflect in ways she hadn't before. "Just thinking," she said, her voice soft but steady. Isaac waited, not pushing, his gaze never leaving her. She knew he could sense there was more, but he didn't ask. Instead, he sat down beside her, his presence steady and warm. "About what?" he asked after a few beats. She let out a long breath, her shoulders relaxing as she finally looked at him. "I don't know. About how everything has changed. How this place has changed me," she said, her voice trailing off slightly. "I never thought I'd find something like this. Not here. Not in a place like this." Isaac nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I never thought I would, either," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. But sometimes things turn out differently than you expect. And it's not always about finding the answers, but about finding the right place to be. Eliza felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something like peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was enough. Enough to feel like she belonged, enough to feel like she had found something worth holding on to. I didn't think I could find peace again, Eliza admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I think I have. Here, with you. Isaac turned to her then, his expression unreadable for a moment. There was a softness in his eyes, a quiet understanding, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above the sound of the wind. I think we've both found something here, he said, his words heavy with meaning. Eliza nodded, her throat tight as she looked away, the weight of the moment almost too much to bear. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for more words. She didn't need him to say anything more. What they had built together, was enough. The world outside was still vast, still full of uncertainty, but in this small house, in this quiet corner of the world, they had found something that was worth more than survival. They had found a home. And as the evening turned to night, and the stars began to twinkle above them, Eliza knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She wasn't alone anymore. Not here. Not with him.